not just on low-income families, but especially on families where one parent decides to stay at home. You're not extending the low-rate band by €2,000, you're extending it by just €1,000 for a couple, the same as you are for an individual. That is fundamentally unfair. When I heard last night about an email that the Taoiseach sent to her Labour Party colleagues, it said something like, the budget would mainly benefit low and middle income earners, working families and vulnerable groups. You wouldn't get that propaganda in North Korea, Taoiseach. I honestly thought that Kim Jong-un had come out of exile to write an email to the Labour Party. That is how misleading it actually was. This Fine Gael Labour government in Ceann Comhairle has decided to fire the first shot today in their general election campaign, and in doing so have proved that they have learned nothing from the crisis that we have just come through. This is a budget straight from the book of old school politics, a budget that is more about short-term political gain than what is right for the economy and our people. But it is also a budget that exposes very clearly this government's flawed priorities. At the first opportunity and the first sign of a recovery, the government's priority is not to undo some of the social harm caused by 6 tough years of austerity, but instead to design tax cuts that disproportionately put far more money in the pockets of higher income earners. That, for me, speaks volumes about where this government's priorities lie. We all know this government's first 3 budgets were deeply regressive, hitting low and middle income families the hardest and leaving the highest income earners in the country off virtually scot-free. When this government cut the respite care grant, cut supports for special needs children and abolished the telephone allowance, no corresponding sacrifice was required by those who had the most. The government is now borrowing money to give a tax cut which will give by far and away the greatest benefit to the better off, and which everyone else will have to repay with interest. That is what is happening. This is the government's first budget since the end of the EU-IMF agreement. This budget gives us a clear sense of this government's lack of priorities. There is no vision for what a post-austerity Ireland will look like, no statement of our values as a people, no talk of fairness or social solidarity, and most depressingly of all, no indication that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated. The government's promise of an end to boom and bust policies rings as hollow as the promise to abolish the prescription charge, the promise to give free GP care to all, and the promise not to increase student fees. People have sacrificed too much for the recovery to be put in jeopardy. Ceann Comhairle, this is a government that took medical cards off the sick, the dying and the disabled until they were shamed into giving them back. This is a government that broke promise after promise after promise in the hope that people would just stop noticing. This is a government that promised an end to cronyism, but instead brought it to a new level. This is a government that delivers income tax cuts for the better off, but abandons the homeless and those crying out for mental health supports. This is a government that deliberately targeted single parents, women, vulnerable elderly people and young people out of work. This is a government that promised us new politics. Well, I think we all know what happened to that. Prior to coming to office, Fine Gael and Labour opposed every measure designed to close the budget deficit, but they now claim 100% of the credit for the job that was 2/3 done for them. The simple fact is this government is now aiming for a deficit that is higher than what it would be if you did nothing today. The opening position for next year is forecasting a deficit of 2.4%, but you're planning to bring that up to 2.7%. Staying the course has been roundly defeated by political expediency and the imperative of the next election. Ceann Comhairle, there is something very disturbing about the way the Independent Irish Fiscal Advisory Council has been treated by this government. And anyone listening to John McHale, the chairman today on Morning Ireland, would really have sat up and taken notice. It's not that I agree with everything that they have said, but I have taken what they have said into account in a genuine way. This government has ignored time and again the independent advice of that council without giving an adequate explanation for doing so. The council advising €2 billion of an adjustment, the government is going in the other direction to the tune of about €1 billion. That is the reality, Minister, and you can shake your head. Instead, Ministers Noonan and Howlin have launched the lifeboat to try to save as many backbench Labour and Fine Gael seats as possible in the next 18 months. We in Fianna Fáil welcome the recent improvement in the economy. There is a recovery taking place. The positive economic data has given people hope that the pain they endured continues to be worthwhile. I know you don't like what I'm saying, and that's why you're heckling. You're trying to drown out what I'm saying. Both ministers were afforded a lot of respect by the opposition, and you're not affording the same respect to us. So, Ceann Comhairle, the economic upturn has happened very quickly. Last year we had hardly any economic growth at all, and the same the previous year. So we make no apologies for urging a degree of caution. In our view, it is time to take a deep breath, to secure the recovery, to assess the real risks, especially external risks, that this country is still facing, and address gaps in vital public services which have opened up in recent years. Any spare resources need to be targeted at those who really need it and those who have borne the brunt of budget cutbacks in recent times. Up to a few weeks ago, the government was predicting modest growth of 2% this year. Now, a raft of positive economic data emerged in very quick succession, not foreseen by this government either, by the way, and it has resulted in the prediction now that the economy will grow by about 5%. In our view, we would be in a much better position and have a much clearer set of data in about 12 months' time as to the real state of the Irish economy, the public finances and indeed the international outlook. And I think you actually know that, Minister Noonan, yourself. But of course the imperative of electoral politics has kicked in. Or as one minister put it in his weekend newspaper, we may not get another budget, he or she anonymously said. In other words, this is the election to spend the money and try to save as many seats as we can. Well, Minister, we in Fianna Fáil are taking a different approach, and for the first time in decades, because you didn't do it in opposition, there is an opposition party prepared to stand back and show the courage to advocate responsible politics rather than popular politics which you are promoting. In opposition, Fine Gael and Labour were cheerleaders for cutting taxes and raising spending. In fact, you were insatiable with your demands during the Celtic Tiger years. Fianna Fáil has learned from the mistakes of the past. This government is about to repeat them. Let me say this, Minister, auction politics was wrong in the past and it is wrong now. We need to accept that this country still faces key risks, many of them external, as I have said. The Eurozone economy is flagging, as you well know. Economic indicators in Germany are deteriorating rapidly. France is seeking 2 further years to bring its deficit into line, and the serious problems in Greece are resurfacing again. The historic low interest rates enjoyed by this state for borrowing will not last indefinitely. The forecast for world growth has been downgraded, and regional conflicts always have the capacity to cause economic instability. Ireland is indeed a small, open economy which relies heavily on external trade. We are, more than most, at the mercy of external factors, but that doesn't seem to have figured too much in your consideration. That is why the recovery should have been allowed to take its first breath before we start giving away the money which you are borrowing to do. We do know some things about the recovery, though, Minister. The recovery has not spread right around the country. And for many people, indeed, the word recovery is absolutely meaningless. If you have a child with special needs awaiting an assessment of need, or seeking access to speech and language therapy or occupational therapy, there is no recovery for you. If you are an elderly person who cannot afford to pay private health insurance and you're waiting for a knee operation, there is absolutely no recovery for you. If you have a loved one waiting to gain access to a nursing home, waiting 4 months now for funding under the Fair Deal scheme, hanging on by their fingertips at home with threadbare support from the state, there is no recovery for you. And if you are a homeless person sleeping not 200 yards from the gate of this stall, there is absolutely no recovery for you. Taoiseach, there are bigger questions to answer. What are we about as a people? What do we really stand for? What are our priorities? And people look to you, Taoiseach, for vision. Anyone listening to you over the last number of months would say that your vision is to cut the marginal rate of tax, which will benefit 1 in 6 income earners. A consultant orthopaedic surgeon went on Liveline last week and said that in the National Orthopaedic Hospital, all 7 operating theatres are closed because the HSE cannot afford to buy the hip replacements. Is that the country that we're living in today? All the while, waiting list spiral, and this government's top priority is to cut the marginal rate of tax. Well, I think it says a lot about the choices which you have made, and people will in time see through those choices, because there is an innate decency in the Irish people. We saw it with the medical cards fiasco over the last couple of years. Even people who weren't affected by what your government did, the unintended consequence of putting €113 million into your budget to save from medical cards, which resulted in people losing medical cards, which you say was never meant to happen. There was a decency in people. Even though they weren't affected, it hit them hard. And that's what people will see in the choices that you have made. That is why we, as a party, have said that extra resources should be made available to areas where a real difference can be made at this time. Improving access to childcare, especially for people looking to access work. Building on the free preschool year introduced by Fianna Fáil, reducing class sizes for our children, which we know gives better educational outcomes and which is the best long-term investment that we can make in this country and indeed our economy, prioritising mental health and suicide awareness, looking after vulnerable people who are older and who need supports at this time, to name but a few priorities. Increasing mortgage interest relief for those who are drowning under the burden of high mortgages, especially those on variable interest rates. Deputy Fleming will speak about a number of those areas in more detail in a moment. Minister, a few weeks ago you gave all the credit to the government for the recovery. The truth is, Minister, that apportioning credit for a recovery that most people do not see is really of little consequence. And it says more about the insecurity of this government than anything else. In my view, the economic progress which has been made can be attributed to a number of factors, not least the reduction in the budget deficit, a process which, as you well know, started back in 2008. And it is a fact you may not welcome, but a fact nonetheless, that Fianna Fáil in government, your predecessor in your office, the late Brian Lenihan, introduced 2/3 of the budget